yourself here, yes.
Monica, it's a wonderful pleasure and privilege to hear you here tonight, and I knew your story would be fascinating and that Anya would bring the best out of you. Just there, you talked about all these people of courage and the marvellous, marvellous women, and you've mentioned so many people that have been written out of the story. And we, in our group, which we were started in '93, when we started going up, we were just amazed and gobsmacked at the amazing women, but also the men, and the courage, and absolute courage that we don't have an idea of, that we saw in Glencree and in so many other places, and among Orange women, that came down to Meath and changed their minds, well, not deliberately, but that started to learn, and we all started to learn from them. And, I don't feel, and I've never felt, that we in the South have done enough in terms of building relationships. I'm not saying about the government, and the Department of Foreign Affairs has done marvellous work in helping and facilitating so many groups, including loyalist groups, who have a great respect for foreign affairs. But in terms of ourselves, the ordinary individual, I remember when the referendum was held and people rang me the next day saying, you can shut up your tents now, you can go home, it's all done, it's over. And that was very much a Southern attitude. Well, we kept going until just a couple of years ago. But you brought up a lot of issues there, and I just want to go back to the soft issues that were neglected, that were left and that are still there, the legacy issues, the sectarianism, the reconciliation work, which needs to be really, really furthered in a much better and more wider way. But also, you mentioned about the current leadership in contest in Britain, about Brexit, about the protocol, and ironically, it's to save the Good Friday Agreement that they're putting this bill through the Parliament, which is bewildering, but it's also showing us how the gulf that is there. And you talked about pragmatism. How can we work towards that? Because none of those contenders look like they will budge on that legislation. Now, the hope would be that it would fall in the House of Lords, but I think there is such a gulf in the understanding, and we need to build that understanding as to what it is the DUP fear and what is down there that we can help with. But also, meanwhile, there was an election in Northern Ireland, and there is still no assembly even, no executive. So does that Good Friday Agreement need now to be reviewed and changed and reformed? And can that be done?
Okay, thank you. Well, there's a review written into the Good Friday Agreement. There always has been. But we have to be very careful about the unintended consequences of changing some of the main parts of that agreement. Remember, those who are most outspoken about saving the agreement never were supportive of the agreement in the first place. So you have to ask, what's the rationale for constantly saying we're here to protect the agreement? I mean, I'm looking at the people on the Conservative Party who actually spoke out against the agreement and still don't think it's a good agreement. And yet they're talking about saving the agreement. But all of what you said, you've answered your own questions. Yes, we have to continue doing that work. And there was a vacuum after the peace agreement was signed. And people didn't have the connections north and south. I remember in the trade union movement, we had much better connections those years than we had after the agreement. And people went into their silos. I often say that the best government officials, Irish government officials, they deserved to be made ambassadors in other countries, but they were the ones who signed our agreement and who knew it best too. And so there's a kind of memory that passes on of how difficult it was to make it. And it's time to pass the baton on to the next generation, but also to those in the South. It's really important that the South understands the difficulties in the North and not just say, God, those two tribes up there, they're at it again. Let them at it. It is much more complex. But I started the talk by saying the relationships are everything. And it's when you reach out, as I did, to discover my own peace talks, that the man responsible for the murder of my boyfriend was sitting next to me at the peace table. Not totally responsible, but in the party that did it. And there were people around that table who had done some awful things, but there was no point in saying, I'm never ever going to talk to these people. So at the end of the day, keep the dialogue going and make it as inclusive. And that's where I put my efforts now. I'm not elected, but civil society in Northern Ireland gives me great hope. And I hope civil society down here likewise, that it's pointing out, who are we talking to? Are we reaching out? I mean, how many people are coming to the North for their holidays? I don't know, but it's a good question.